literature, it's not that clear which carb intake is optimal for aging. But I think in general, it's energy excess that causes faster aging. And so we should be able to eat a 30% carb diet, which doesn't create an excess of glucose in the body, and that shouldn't shorten lifespan.
Thank you. Now, Chris, I know you're a big believer in no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach for anybody. Is there any segment of the population where safe starches would actually end up being unsafe for them?
Well, I'd be happy to answer that question, Jimmy, but I want to take a step back first. I think there's a real tendency to get caught up in biochemical and mechanistic arguments in discussions like this, and while I don't doubt the importance of looking at those mechanisms, the fact is that there's a lot we still don't understand. And not too long ago, we thought that cholesterol clogged the arteries and that was the cause of heart attacks. And of course, we now know that that's not the case. So I think we need to clarify the debate. Number one, are we talking about starch being safe for healthy people? Are we talking about it being safe for people with type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance? To me, those are different discussions. Number two, if we are saying that starch is not safe for healthy people, I think there's little to no human evidence supporting that idea. And there's lots of evidence that opposes it. Billions of people around the world are consuming starch safely right now as we speak. And there are several examples of cultures around the world that consume a large percentage of calories from starch and are free of obesity and cardiovascular disease and other modern inflammatory diseases. A few examples Chris Masterjohn mentioned earlier in the last presentation are the Kitava in the Pacific Islands, who consume 70% of their calories from carbohydrate, the Okinawans, who consume 85% of their calories from carbohydrate, and 50% of those come specifically from starch in the form of sweet potatoes, and the Tucasenta that get 95% of their calories from starch. And they are all lean and fit and free of modern inflammatory disease. So if we're going to say that starch is unsafe, we have to have some way of explaining how these populations, several different populations around in different parts of the world, consume a large percentage of calories from starch and manage to remain free of all of these conditions. And then Professor Lieberman, who kicked off the discussion, or did the first presentation here at this symposium, mentioned the role that starch has played in human evolution, and it gave us an alternative to fruit and protein. And Chris Masterjohn showed that humans have more copies of salivary amylase genes than non-human primates, and many anthropologists believe that starch played a crucial role in evolution, and along with meat may have been responsible for the increase in human brain size. So some would argue that we wouldn't even be sitting here having this debate if it weren't for starch. So, and then finally, when it comes to evidence about starch or carbohydrate intake decreasing longevity, I don't think there's really any solid evidence for that in humans. There's some evidence for it in C. elegans, which is a roundworm. But roundworms are about 1 millimeter long, they're transparent, and they're either male or hermaphrodite. So I'm not really sure we can make those correlations. There's a lot of evidence that starch consumption does not affect longevity in humans. I mentioned the Okinawans earlier. Okinawans that were born in 1950 or before consumed a diet that consisted, again, of 85% carbohydrate, and 50% of that was from sweet potatoes alone. And they have the longest life expectancy at birth that's been measured yet. It's 86 years for men and 86 for women and 78 for men. Their life expectancy at 65 is the longest in the world, 24 years longer for women and 18 and a half for women and 18 and a half years for men. They have the highest number of centenarians in any population measured in the world. And once again, if starch is the toxin, glucose is the toxin that Dr. Rosedale would have us believe, it's to me difficult to reconcile that with some of what we observe in the anthropological literature.
So perhaps with the caveat that those cultures are able to tolerate the starch a little better because they've grown up in that culture, they weren't exposed to ho-hos, ding-dongs, Doritos, and all the stuff that we have. Maybe that means all bets are off?
Well, I think it means that it's pretty clear that starch is safe for some people. And it's hard to argue against that. I wouldn't argue against the idea that some people can't tolerate a lot of starch or glucose because of insulin resistance or other problems, even genetic and epigenetic predispositions that don't enable them to process starch as well. But to me, I think we really have to separate these two conversations, because otherwise we run the risk of throwing out an entire class of foods without really much human evidence to support that.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the whole safe starch thing in my mind is it's an across-the-board thing for people in their minds. They see, oh, safe starch, that gives me permission to have starch without any caveats at all. I mean, people will see that and go, oh, I guess I can have a white potato, never mind what it's doing to my blood sugar, and those kinds of things. Now, Kate, you said that you didn't really see this a lot with your patients, having them on a low-carb diet. Did the low-carb diet that you included, which has 70 grams of carbohydrate, did it include some starch in it, or how did they get to the 70?
Well, my view is that sugar is sugar, so it doesn't matter whether it comes from fruit or from a banana, something that's starchy like a potato. So basically, I just want to keep them away from anything processed and have them have their their sugars in the form of whatever it is that is as fresh and healthy as possible. You even get sugar from cabbage, so I don't really care. So we just calculated it as long as they follow a couple other rules, like that it's not going to be processed, they're going to have the right fats. I do include fermentation, which always lowers the starch content of things like cabbage. Anything that gets fermented, the sugar content gets reduced. But I just wanted to briefly address something about the Okinawan diet, because when I was in Hawaii, many of the folks were from Okinawa, and I think that when Americans interpret diets from other countries, we do so with a very biased and jaundiced eye, and I don't really believe the statistics that you cited. I'm sure you had good reason to say what you said, but I don't believe them, because the folks who were there said that they had their own gardens, they were fishing all the time. Rice is very difficult to grow, and so they didn't grow that much of it. They used other vegetables, green vegetables, and some fruits. Often would have their own chickens. So I don't see that they would have had so much starch in their diets. And also in Hawaii, I didn't see that they were genetically adapted to high starch diets, because when they started eating rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, they got diabetes and got overweight just like everyone else. So the longevity data has to be interpreted very carefully, because there's so many confounding variables, not the least of which is this epigenetics sort of wild card that we don't really understand the generational influences of the people that now are living to be 90. When they grew up, their world was different. There was no trans fat. Everything was practically organic. So, we are not living to be 90, because I'm not 90. I'm not even half that. But so I don't know how long I'm going to live, and so we can't say that the Okinawans, what we see them doing now, is going to make them live to be 90. So there's just so many confounding variables in any of this. All I can say is when my patients keep their numbers generally between like a low of 20 and a high of 70, they don't of grams of carb from any source in the context of what I define as a traditional diet, with the diversity of meat products that people used to eat, which also includes some organ meats, some bone broths, a lot of stuff talked about at the Weston Price Foundation tables. If you want to go there, they'll give you more information on that, as well as fermented vegetables with the probiotics. So it's not just about macronutrients, it's about how we cook our foods, and there's a lot of differences even in just preparing your starchy foods. You can prepare them in ways where they're going to interact with the protein in ways that's going to make that starch not so safe. So in my experience in clinic, I say 30 to 70 is good, and the range, I believe, is important. And really a traditional diet. Paleo diet is one type, I believe, of a traditional diet. It's a traditional diet from a very long time ago that we don't have a lot of details about, But we do have a lot of details about many other traditional diets. And if you watch TV shows like No Reservations or some of the cooking channel shows, you'll get to see how much diversity people have in these other countries in their diet that we don't have. And I think that's a lot of what's missing from our discussions on a healthy diet, is a huge diversity.
Thank you. Now, Ron, some in the ancestral community would say, oh, it's not really about what you're talking about with blood sugar. It's just real food. As long as you stick to real food, no matter what those sources of real food are, potatoes, fruit, it's real food, then you should eat it, and it should be a part of your ancestral diet. Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, that goes down to the, I think, more basic question. Let me try and clear up a little confusion here. When I first started doing this, it was well over 20 years ago when I first proposed a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And then it was met with incredible resistance. There were maybe 4 or 5 people in the world that believed in a very low carb diet, or even a low carb diet at all at that time, and they were all high protein. So I'm the last person standing because of the high fat. And the reason I got there was because I was looking at commonalities among all life, not differences. Our commonalities are much more important. Those are the things that life cannot live without. So you look at cholesterol. You brought up cholesterol, and it's true, that there's, and I unfortunately have to take some of the blame for putting cholesterol on the map. And I won't go into, I don't have time to go into that story, but when I was in medical school, there was a huge lawsuit. Anyway, got cholesterol, and I know we were wrong. And the reason I knew we were wrong is because cholesterol is part and parcel of all life. You can't live without cholesterol. It's a part of every cell membrane. So how can you say that you want to take it away? You can't have a steroid molecule without cholesterol. It's really important. So it's one of the few commonalities among life. It's not whether it's there or whether it's not. And in fact, life is not even determined by the parts that it is made up of. Life is determined by the instructions given to the parts. So for us, we're 15 trillion cells,